Hello all, welcome to the next video. This is going to be an extension of our discussion of classes. And in this video we're going to learn how to actually use this rectangle class, this blueprint, this template. And we are going to look into how to develop the class further, how to expand it, how to make it slightly more useful, because right now all it does is it builds rectangles of length 5 and width 5. That's it. And it can calculate area and perimeter, and right now that's not super useful. We want to be able to make modifiable rectangles, rectangles that can be expanded or contracted or start with different values. And so we're going to start out by making a new class to test our rectangle. So we'll say rectangle test. And again, I'm going to type in my main method. And you'll notice that my other class, my rectangle class, my template, does not have a main method. It's not going to be running anything. It's just there to provide us with some structure. And this structure is a way to hold information and manipulate that information. Now, in rectangle test, that's where we're going to be using this class. Now notice, since rectangle is in the same directory as rectangle test, we don't have to import it. You may have noticed in some other videos, perhaps in future videos, I'll be importing things like javadoc for scanner. In this case, we don't have to do that because this class exists in the same directory and we can reference it directly. So, how do I create a new rectangle? How would I make a rectangle out of my class, out of my template, out of my blueprint? Well, the way I do that is I use the word rectangle. It's like declaring a variable. And put that in quotes because it's slightly more than just like a primitive data type. Well, we're going to say that the type of my variable is going to be rectangle. And I might call it, I need to give it a name, an identifier, just like any other variable declaration. I'll call it rect1. And I'll have to do something. I'll have to initialize it. But really, when I'm talking about classes, I'm not really initializing. There's another word we talk about. It's called instantiating. I'm creating an instance or an occurrence of the rectangle class. You may know, or you may not know, back in the day, way back in the day, and even now, there's this game World of Warcraft, and people used to say when they went into a new dungeon that they were entering an instance. And an instance is just a copy of the dungeon that is built just for a certain set of adventurers to use. A 5-group party, or 20-group party, or whatever it is. But it's separated from, it's based on a template of that dungeon, and players go into it and use it, but it doesn't modify the template itself, and there can be many of these instances at once. And so in this case, we're looking at something called an instance. We're instantiating an object. And so here we're creating an object from a class template. So we'll use the new keyword to do this. We'll say new rectangle. And that's all we have to do. Why do we say this? Well, this is our constructor from before. If I go back to the rectangle file, you'll notice that this is called rectangle. And that's what I'm looking at when I look at rectangle here. So I'm going to save this temporarily. I'm going to go back to my rectangle file, my rectangle class definition, and I'm going to do a little comment here to show that this is exactly what I'm looking at. So I'm going to make a javadoc comment, again the double star slash, and here I'm going to do constructor rectangle constructor. Okay, and this is just going to say makes a new rectangle with width 5 and length 5. With width 5.0 and length 5.0. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to move to my rectangle test. I'm going to mouse over, and my note is right there. Hey, how about that? This is the use of javadoc comments. When I put one of those slash double stars comments above a method or above a rectangle, Eclipse will read that and it'll give you that whenever you're using it, whenever you're using the method above which it's written. And so here I've made a javadoc comment and tells me exactly what this constructor does. So this rectangle I've made, this object, I've made an object. So what I've done is I've declared and instantiated a rectangle object. Now let's see how I can use this. I'm going to try to print rectangle 1. And what are our methods? Well, we have a getArea method and a getPerimeter method. So let's get the area. And notice when I call it, again, it's similar to the way you would call system.out.println. There are parentheses, there's a dot, there's a name of a variable, the name of the method. So here, I'm doing the exact same thing that I'm doing right here, except this one I wrote myself. So let's run this and see what we get. I'll run the file, or I'll run the program, and I get 25. Does that make sense? Well, 5 times 5 is 25. Well, that works. Let's test out our getPerimeter function method. Same thing. And I get 20. Well, 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5, that checks out. So these function the way we sort of were expecting them to. But the problem is I can't change my rectangle values. And I can't give it new values to start out. How would I do that? Well, I'd have to change my constructor. I'd have to make a new builder, a new construction worker who has a mind of her own, right? So she's going to go out and she's going to say, okay, well, I see this template for a rectangle. I see what it has to have, so I'll build it with that stuff. But this time I want to be able to modify the width and the length. And so I'm going to build it with different widths and different lengths depending on the situation. And this construction worker is smart, you know, different rectangles for different situations. I mean, whenever you need a rectangle, you know, it better fit the situation. So what I'm going to do is I got to make a new constructor. I'm allowed to leave the old one there. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say public rectangle. And obviously there's an issue here. Wait a second, I can't do that because I have a duplicate method. I already have a constructor called rectangle. So what can I do to make another constructor? Would I just have to rewrite the old one? Well, it turns out I can overload the constructor. I can make a few versions of it. with different parameters. So as long as the method signature, as long as this header is slightly different, it's okay. It's all good to go. And the way we make it different is we say, hey, let's take in a value for the width. Let's take in a value for the length. This is my constructor. It's a slightly different constructor. This is a smarter constructor. It's taking in some information, so the user can provide information on what type of rectangle they want to build. So now I have to just say that width is equal to, or is assigned the value of W. And length is assigned the value of L. Now, as we haven't discussed methods in detail yet, this may seem a little confusing. But the important thing to note is that these variables, W and L, they only exist within this area. If you try to use W elsewhere, for instance in here, you'll get a big error, and the error says cannot be resolved to a variable because we haven't defined it outside of the method header. That means it's sort of temporary. It's a local variable. It only exists inside these braces. Outside of there, they don't exist. But what does exist outside of the braces? These two variables. And these two variables, my instance variables, are going to be created with every new rectangle, and they're going to persist a lot longer than these local method variables, these constructor variables. And so what that means is they're for holding long-term information. These variables here are for holding short-term information, and they're just there to stand in for what the user ends up inputting. So I'll show you how this works. So W, if I have a javadoc comment, it'll say, oh, we have a parameter. This is called a parameter, each of these. The parameter W, the user defined width, and the user defined length. Okay, so it's a smarter constructor? Probably. So let's see how this works. We'll go in here. We'll make a new rectangle. We'll call it rect2. And we'll set it equal to new rectangle. But this time, instead of just leaving it like that, I'm going to give it some numbers. I can give it a double to start. I'll say 8.0. And it still gives me an error because it says the constructor is undefined because I'm only using one. I have to use two here. Let's say 8.0 and 2.0. So I'll have an 8x2 rectangle. And this should create a rectangle that's 8x2. Well, let's see if it does. How do we test it? Well, we can say, okay, rect2.getArea, and the area should be 16 meters. So we'll run that, and it certainly is. Now let's get the perimeter. The perimeter, 20 units, well, 8 plus 2 is 10. 8 plus 2 is 10. We add those together, 20. So you can see I have two rectangles here. They both have different information. While the perimeters are the same, the areas are certainly different, which means that the values there are different. This one is a 5x5 rectangle, and this one is an 8x2 rectangle. And we've been able to define it. Obviously, I could change this to 10, and I'd see that the area is changed to 20. I could change it to 2.5, like that, we'd see that I get an area of 5 and maybe a perimeter of 9. 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5, plus 2 is 9. And so you can see that this ends up being relatively useful, especially if we get into things that are more than just, basic rectangles. I can make coordinate systems with this. I can make game characters. I can make student records. I can make all sorts of things. I can make entire web pages with this technique. This is called object-oriented programming, and this is the basic, most simple facet of it. The building of templates, and then the creation of objects based on those templates. In the next video, we're going to look at slightly more advanced extensions of a rectangle class. We're going to talk about the toString method. We're going to talk about setters and getters, and then we're going to use those in our test class. Until next time, good night.